afternoon, everyone. My name is Cynthia Chang-Mintz, and I was the person who proposed this whole idea. I will be introducing our moderator, Dr. Bill Ju, who is a professor of neurobiology and human biology at U of T.
Okay, thanks. So I'm just going to introduce myself very briefly, and then my fellow panelists will introduce themselves really briefly. I'm particularly interested in mental health for a variety of reasons. One of those reasons being that I myself have had issues with mental health and have had bouts of depression, and those are things that I'm very happy to share with my students to let them know that they're not facing these types of issues by themselves. But in addition to that, because of my position at the university, I take a lot of responsibility in seeing so many of my students being affected by issues related to mental health. And it's always been one of those issues that I hope to be able to impact on. And I hope that today will be a good place to discuss some of those different issues. And Ken, yes?
Sure, my name is Kenneth Fung, and I'm a psychiatrist. And I'm also affiliated with the Department of Psychiatry of University of Toronto. So I'm head of the Asian Initiative Mental Health Program, which is a clinical program at the Toronto Western Hospital, and we provide services to mainly Cantonese and Mandarin-speaking populations. I'm also interested in how culture interfaces with mental health, as well as psychotherapy. So along those lines, I do some teaching and some research into cultural psychiatry and also in psychotherapy. A day a week, I also consult to Hong Kong Mental Health Association, which you're going to hear lots about next. And there I see some Vietnamese patients, Cambodian patients, and one or two Korean patients there as well. Maybe I'll leave at that for now.
Okay. So my name is Emily. I come from a, I guess, formal and informal support mental health association. It's like Dr. Fung mentioned, that we're Hong Fook Mental Health Association. We serve 5 languages, very specifically funded for that only. Mandarin, Cantonese, Vietnamese, Korean, and Cambodian. So my background's I've been doing a lot of prevention and promotion. We serve individuals with not yet touched by mental illness. They might have some mental health issues. So we have a lot of service for them. And if you can ask any area of interest later on, you can ask me. And we also, as Hong Fook, we are very specialized in diversity and very specific language program. We also very interested in refugees and immigrants just across the GTA and Ontario-wise. So myself with another team member, we travel Ontario to train professionals, settlement workers, school workers, police officers sometimes, about mental health and immigrants and what they go through on a daily basis. I think right now we're the only agency beside the Canadian victim of torture is consult to the IRCC for the Syrian refugees. We've been doing that for, I believe, 2-3 years now, and we'll continue to have secure funding for another 3 years. So that's, we've never seen that across IRCC because we receive so much Syrian refugees.
Hi, I'm Larissa. I don't work as a mental health caregiver. I'm on the other side of the mental health system. I have experiences of lived mental health issues, and I'm here because Katie wanted an Asian Canadian on the panel who had lived experience of mental illness. And I went to U of T for my undergrad and UBC for my master's. And when I was in undergrad, I published a book called Becoming Silver Girl, which is a series of short stories that describes some experiences I had in the hospital, where I was, like, as a 16-year-old, I was hospitalized for a mental illness. So I try to do some mental health advocacy. I hope I make a difference. But I mean, all we can do is try and make a difference. So I'm really happy to be here today. Thank you for having me.
Okay, so thanks to all the panelists, and I think we have a variety of different sort of backgrounds, and I think the one issue that we sort of been talking about before the actual session began was whether or not there were specific barriers for mental health and mental wellness in the Asian community, and maybe I can ask some of the panelists what your take on either unique barriers or specific barriers in the Asian community, what those might be.
Maybe I can start, because I've been doing a lot of prevention and promotions in the community, especially in the Vietnamese community. Just a little bit of background of how I come about interested in this kind of work. I love frontline as well as advocacy and education. My grandparents, have you heard of boat people? Yeah, my grandparents came here by boat and get accepted to this beautiful country. I came when I was very little. Still feel the effect of my grandparents and even my parents and some of ways how we grew up. I grew up in a small town, so a lot of discriminations and not a lot of information for our family. That's tied into how I'm interested in mental health, especially for immigrants and refugees. I've been going through different cities, whether it's big city like Toronto or Ottawa or even big city, Windsor, London. Everywhere I go, the first question I ask is, what is mental health, or what does mental health mean to you? I kid you not, 90% people tell me about mental illness. I said, I didn't ask you about mental illness, I asked you about mental health. So there is a big barrier for people who did not understand what is mental health issues, and what is mental illness. And because of, especially in the sort of like minorities of the populations, we didn't even have what the term for mental health or mental illness. Like, I'd have to tell my clients, my clients' parents about their issues, and they're already upset, saying that, why are you telling me that my child having issues? They don't have issues. We don't have mental illness here, right? So it's a stigma, big stigma, and not understanding exactly what it is. Everybody should have mental health. That's a standard, right, Dr. Fong?
Absolutely. Do you want to go next?
Okay. I think I was wondering how I was going to answer this question. I think the specific unique barriers that Asian communities experience with mental health or mental illness has to do with some core values that Asian families, the values that Asian families place on. The importance that Asian families place on these values. One of them is like family honor. I think that's something that's like historically very important. And another thing I think is like education. So there's this perception, I think, in a lot of Asian families that honor is very important. Like, if you do something that is going to bring shame on yourself, you are going to bring shame on your family too. And you're going to bring shame on your children, and you're going to bring shame on generations to come. You're airing out your dirty laundry, i.e. mental illness or mental health issue, and that is something to be ashamed of. So that's shame that you're bringing on your family, not just yourself. And I hear this all the time in Asian communities that, if you do something that is bringing shame on your family, well, that's something that your children are going to suffer for. Like, it's like their punishment for something you did. So there's like this huge pressure to not bring shame on your family and that causes people to want to conceal their mental illness rather than bring shame and punishment on their children and their children's children. And so another thing I think is like education, especially for people my age. There's huge importance placed on education, and I grew up in a Canadian system, but for my cousins and friends who grew up in like Hong Kong or Singapore or mainland China or whatnot, I don't know about anywhere else, I just can speak to those countries. There's like this like pressure cooker when it comes to education. Like there's a lot of competition, there's a lot of fear over not succeeding, and that's a lot to handle when you're young. So I think that's a barrier too, is that, you know, if you can't handle your own education, well, shame on you, that's a weakness. So people would rather, you know, suffer in silence than talk about it, about how they're struggling to keep up with their school and stuff. So yeah.
Yeah, I agree with all the previous comments. The understanding of mental illness and also mental health can be quite different from culture to culture. And I would say in general, in most cultures, there is an insufficient understanding of mental health, mental illness, and there's a lot of stigma associated with it. Oftentimes, even in mainstream media, the only time we ever talk about mental illness often is if there's a violent incident or something terrible happens, and then suddenly you hear the news report, it's all about mental illness. So I think there is a perception perhaps that mental illness must be something dangerous, must be something shameful. I think that is a perception in many cultures, including Canada in general. Like if you look at how the media often covers stories and sensationalize certain aspects. Certainly in the Asian culture, this is happens a lot too. Like if I talk to my patients or most Asians have this concept that mental illness is affiliated with something dangerous, and they always think about the most extreme cases. And it's a sense of loss of control, or they would see it as what Larissa is saying, is your personal weakness. Okay, if you just pull up your own socks, things will be fine. And so that is one of the barriers. In the study of comparison across cultures, oftentimes we, in the field, even from a mental health professional standpoint, we see that the Asian population tend to we call somatization. That is to say that oftentimes Asians, when they have difficulties, they focus on the bodily changes, like I can't sleep, I have a headache, I have a back pain, I have indigestion. And so they often present to family doctors with these physical complaints, probably not knowing or not wanting to admit that there is a psychological component. And so this kind of thing, it's studied in the literature, is called somatization, is one of the cultural aspects, perhaps, of different cultures expressing the distress differently, that they would kind of focus on the physical aspect. And it's interesting, there was even a study in Hong Kong, and these are like Hong Kong doctors, and it was found that they kind of miss cases of depression when a Hong Kong person is seeing a Hong Kong doctor versus one of the foreigners in Hong Kong seeing the same Hong Kong doctors, right? So that is to say that even within one's own culture, Chinese doctors can miss all the time a person coming in front of them and presenting with a mental health concern. So when I was doing research, I remember I was sitting as a fellow on a family doctor's office. So I had a nice chat with an elderly woman, and she was telling me all about the difficulties that she's having in the family, and she was like tearing up and all that. And then she's waiting to see the family doctor. So I said, okay, are you going to tell this to Dr. So-and-so? She goes, oh no, he's such a nice doctor. I won't tell him about all this stuff. I'm here for my blood pressure check, right? I'm here to get some pills for my headache. So that's what she was saying, right? After saying all this to me. And there is some loss in translation, so to speak, when people are labeling this as an issue that needs professional help until it's too late. And this is borne out by studies that shows that by the time someone really goes reach out for help in the Asian community, and if we look at the hospitalizations, this is from research studies, that oftentimes it's more severe, because they wait until it gets really bad. And if you look at foreign students, there are a lot of Asian students, there's a high underutilization of services to, let's say, student mental health. Like by percentage, you expect a lot more, but they just will not be approaching. And I think some of the cultural factors of both understanding, also feeling shame, and what Larissa is saying, there's this kind of collective shame. You feel it's a shame to the family, or the parents want to deny it. So in some ways, I'm also a parent because with someone with mental illness, because my son is in the autistic spectrum. So and I understand the pressure because I also run groups for other parents with children with autism, and we compare notes. And oftentimes in Chinese families, you know how Chinese families come together and they say, oh, my son is doing so-and-so, and is in the piano lessons, and she's now taking horseback riding, and what's your son doing? I would say, well, my son is learning how to speak with correct grammar or something, or learning what emotions mean. And a lot of parents wouldn't do that. A lot of parents have difficulty admitting to the fact that, you know, your son have a developmental disability or mental disorder. So I can understand the pressures that parents face, and even my own family members might say, oh, you know, you're just overreacting. He's such a bright boy. He's going to be fine. You guys are over-labeling things. If you don't acknowledge it will go away, he's going to grow out of it. And when I first chose to go into psychiatry, my parents said to me, why are you doing that? You know, you're going to get yourself killed, right? So why do you pick that profession, you know? Why don't you be a good cardiologist or something like that? It's like, I can be proud of. And why do you go be weird and be a psychiatrist? That's not even a real doctor, right? So this stigma, I think, perpetuates not only if you are a family member or if you are someone with the illness, or even if you're in the healthcare professional. I think that we all kind of share that kind of stigma. In addition to stigma, there is the access issue, because language is a huge issue. Dealing with immigrants, even if they speak English, a lot of our patients say that there's a difference between speaking English to communicate and there's speaking your own language to tell your own story, to talk about your own emotions, to have that cultural understanding of some of the issues that they face. So once you get past the stigma, then it's the access issue to cultural and linguistically appropriate services, people whom you feel that's safe to talk about your culture, to convey in your own language. And just because of what I just mentioned, I think that a lot of Chinese families or Asian families encourage their children to go to medicine, but I doubt you'll find any families that encourage them strongly to go pick psychiatry. And so I think that leads to also that causes this lack in the system. That, let's say in GTA, with such a huge Chinese population, and even with all the stigma, we have a huge waiting list. And that's because, and Hong Kong has a huge waiting list,
Yes.
right? We kind of both promote it. At the same time, we know that there's a wait list because there's not enough funding. In the whole health system in general, even the government likes to give more money to the cardiologist than mental health care. And secondly, even if you do have the money, you try to hire someone who speaks the language with the mental health background is actually very hard, because even if you find someone who goes to medicine, they would rather be known as a neuroscientist than to be known for a mental health professional.
Yes.
And even then, if you go to, and I do have some colleagues who are Chinese who are psychiatrists, and then they don't want to serve the Chinese community. So that is the final step, is they don't want to be associated with the Chinese population, actually. They say, I want to be seen as a generalist. I want to serve the mass public. I don't want to get labeled as to serve the community's problems. Too much pressure. Yeah. Too much pressure, that often they don't want to be labeled as the Chinese psychiatrist. They want to be seen as, I'm just like any other Canadian, so I'm going to be a mood disorder expert, and people don't see. So this is the cultural identity piece. And we can all think about that We can get to this whole debate. I don't know if we're going on to the next question, but this cultural identities also affects, I think, people in the mental health professional field. There are people whom don't want to be seen for their Chineseness. They want to be seen almost as a white person or a regular Canadian person. So they get offended. Like, why do you have, why come to me for a Chinese person? I'm just like another resident, another specialist. So I want to be seen as a journalist and not be, they would say I'm pigeonholed if you see me as the Chinese psychiatrist. So it's very interesting, the psychological phenomena, even when you get to that stage.
Yeah. And what do you think of this identity issue, that they don't want to be pigeonholed? Do you think it's a valid concern that they don't want to be pigeonholed, or?
I think it's a valid concern of some kind. But to pick it probably take a step back. If we look at the different generations, and in this cultural mosaic of Canada, we are allowed to embrace different cultures. You can be Chinese Canadian, Iranian Canadian, Indian Canadian. And so in this Canadian culture, theoretically, there's an embrace of multiculturalism more so than most countries in a way. But still, I think that, especially for the second and third generation, sometimes there is a culture of trying to not be so different. And so there are people who study this. You go through in your own mind that you're just like everybody else, right? And so, sometimes people downplay that cultural unique aspect to emphasize the Canadian part. And sometimes that happens in most races until they encounter maybe a discrimination or some unfair systemic issues. Then suddenly what we see in some people is they flip the opposite side and say they want to embrace their own culture, they want to fight the white domination, and they go the opposite extreme. And then usually the journey goes, then they come to embrace that they're both the strengths and the weaknesses of every culture, and then we can weave as a mosaic. But that is kind of like a whole psychological journey that oftentimes people go through in their journey. So you see that there are second generations who don't speak the language, who don't want to speak their own language.
So could I ask, in that particular instance, when you have a second generation Chinese, Korean, or some other East Asian population, would they feel more comfortable seeing you, or would they feel more comfortable seeing, a different doctor? What would your take on that be?
Yeah, that's very interesting, and maybe all the panelists can. I don't want to hog up the airtime. I'm conscious.
That's okay. You can answer that questions, but I think
conscious of the airtime.
yeah. So I think it's also go back to what your question was: is that why is they don't want it to be perceived as a Chinese psychiatrist? I work with a lot of young adults. We call 1.5 generation or second generation. Have you heard of that term, 1.5? Okay, 1.5 is something like me. I was not born here, but I raised here with the educations and the culture that I can be value both, okay? Right, so, same for me. Okay, so everybody on the same page now. I see a lot of students themselves do not want to see a Vietnamese psychiatrist, or even if they are international students. They would say, you know what, I need some translation, but I'm okay, because they're afraid of the community is big, but it's so small, right? It's a private issues, as well as they just don't have the concept. When they have issues, they think the whole world is focused on that. So I see a lot of my students actually asking for non-Asian psychiatrists. Yeah.
I think it's very individual. There are definitely lots of patients who seek out the Asian because they understand. They would say, you understand the parental pressure, the expectations more than anybody else. There are others who would be on the flip side, would say, you will be just like my dad, you will be just like my mom. Even in communication, if they're bilinguals, there are people who would they would speak in their own language, and suddenly when they, let's say, talk about sex, they suddenly flip to English, and they say, I don't feel comfortable talking about anything related to sex in Chinese because that sounds so yucky. But but if I speak to English, everyone's talking about sex. I can talk about my sexual issues in English. So there's a perception of different cultures having different degrees of openness, acceptance, and then there's this issue of will you, for very small communities, like the Cambodian community, everyone knows everyone else.
Yeah.
I know that they're highly sensitive. Chinese is getting better because now we're getting a critical mass.
And because they don't have the terminology. Even I know for a lot of my youth don't have the terminology just to explain mental illness or something like that because it's related to a very negative experience that the parents might yell at them like that all the time, right? So it's very, very difficult for them to even mention it and share.
And Larissa, would you seek out a Chinese person or a non-Chinese person? Or it doesn't
One thing
matter?
that I've noticed in the mental health care system is that there's so limited resources sometimes. You just see whoever is available first. I never get to choose who I see.
That's true.
It's true.
Maybe one of the topics that I sort of sorry, yes.
Sorry, just as a follow-up to your discussion here, do you think this phenomenon that you're seeing comes from just a personal understanding of that individual, or is a peer pressure that is still in existence maybe in society, so we should kind of still group or congregate differently or culturally or try to fit in? So even from patient or a physician point of view, why you were saying that people would choose to practice whether within their own community or not. Do you think peer pressure plays a role here?
I think there's just a natural tendency to want to blend in when you get to somewhere new. You want to pick up the ways of living that are in your new home or whatnot, especially for immigrants. I'm only touching, I'm sure, on what's a huge iceberg. So, but there's a lot below the surface of. I think it's more than just peer pressure. I don't think it's explicitly oh, you should see an Asian doctor if you're Asian, or you should try to blend in more if you're an Asian doctor and you treat Asian patients that you are not being a generalist. There's not explicit things, I think, that are being said, but I think there's just a tendency to want to, dress a certain way when you go to, when you visit somewhere, you dress sometimes the way the locals do or whatnot. I'm not sure.
So when an immigrant go to a different place, so there's an interface of two different cultures because you bring kind of your own culture, you're interfacing with a new culture. So this process of cultural change in psychology, they call it acculturation. Acculturation meaning kind of almost adaptation or change of culture over time. And this acculturation process is different for everyone. So Barry, who's from Canada, a Canadian, he has proposed a bidimensional model of acculturation that every individual is different. Some people may choose to completely blend in, right? So we call that process assimilation, a psychological process assimilation. They want to dress like a mainstream Canadian. They want to act and talk and go to the places like a Canadian. So almost forget about their home identity. That's kind of assimilation. There are those that are opposite, and they would continue on as if nothing has changed. They would only shop in Chinatown. They would only go to Chinese restaurants. They would only see a Chinese doctor. And there are lots of those people too. And they are kind of using an isolation kind of strategy because they feel most comfortable. There is an integration strategy where a person is kind of fluid and goes to kind of do both. And then there's finally the last category, a person who feels like they're losing touch with their home culture, but they can't fit in. So they feel like they are marginalized. So we call that marginalization, where they kind of fall through the cracks. So this is like a grid, like a 2x2, and each individual is different. Plus, each community is different. If you go to immigrate to a place where there's only white people and there are Asians, and let's say if you were in Calgary or some of the other places, which is now getting a big Chinese population, but maybe 10 years ago, 20 years ago, there's no choice. And so maybe there's a pressure to either integrate or assimilate, right? If you come to Toronto now and you go to a certain high school, I have patients who continue to never speak English except to deal with the teacher because all their friends are from China, they all speak Mandarin together, they go to karaoke after class together and sing Mandarin songs, right? So they can continue to really uphold that culture. So I think each group is different, but it's dependent a little bit on what's available, what the resources are, and also, of course, who's the dominant in power. The fact that and Statistics Canada is going to show you, right, that if you are a white person, you're going to make more money than the average, first of all, racialized or immigrant for the same education, controlling for everything else. So there is also a pressure to want to blend in or to aspire to become just like the dominant group. So there's a power differences. So there's the individual choice, but there's also what's available in the community, and then there's the power in society. What's this Canadian structure favoring? What kind of person it's going to be most likely to succeed to get a higher paying job? That's going to be also the pressure towards that side as well. So all these factors, I think, come into play.
And I think just to add on that is different people is experience differently. I tell you a funny story about myself. I grew up here, so I always tell people that I'm Canadian Vietnamese. So I think my Vietnamese aspect is very huge. I volunteer in the Vietnamese community. I wear the traditional Vietnamese dress, and I celebrate so-called Vietnamese New Year instead of Lunar New Year. So I'm very proud, but I still think that the Canadian in me is a lot. But then at some point, I experienced discriminations or, because I grew up in a smaller town. So sometimes they call me Chings or whatever. So I sort of cocoon myself to I'm Vietnamese Canadian. Because really I look Vietnamese. I'm Canadian, but I'm Vietnamese Canadian. And then not too long ago, about 3 years ago, I went to Vietnam and totally culture shock. And I'm like, I'm Canadian. So my mom said, yeah, let's pack up and go, because after 30 years, so when I come back here, again, if I experience something, I will go back and say, I'm Vietnamese Canadian, and I'm really, so there was a phenomenal, Dr. Fung, there was a curve that everybody go through. At some point, you go up and you say, I'm Canadian, but then something happened, you're like, I'm Vietnamese Canadian, and then you're Canadian Vietnamese, and then you're Canadian. Right? So I think that's very unique to a person's experience and the area, like Dr. Fung said, that the environment that you're into, and encourage yourself to understand and nurture that. And it's okay. I always tell my youth that it's okay if you feel that way, nurture that feeling.
Sorry, just before we kind of move on, I wanted to also talk a little bit about sort of peer grouping. So in the teaching stream, for example, which is a little different than the clinical world, I find it's exactly the same thing. So even though I have access to a lot of different mentors throughout the university, and I actually make use of them, most of them aren't Asian. So I actually have to look outside of the university to find people who are 10 or 15 years ahead of me to find the appropriate mentors to kind of tell me a little bit about what sorts of pressures that they faced or what sort of discrimination that they faced. I actually had to contact people at UBC because I couldn't find anyone here at the University of Toronto. So I think there is sort of a natural sort of stratification of peer bonding, if you want, or looking at people that sort of are like-minded as yourself. And I wanted to ask, because it was a topic that Emily, you had brought up, that sometimes when individuals in the Asian community, they seek help, it's a little bit too late because they've waited a lot longer than they should have. And I was wondering if you could discuss your own experiences, Larissa, perhaps, and your clinical experiences, whether or not there's a stigma against taking medication within the Asian community, because I know that medication isn't the only sort of route that might be useful for individuals, but I think that in general, like one of the things that I've noticed is that in the Asian community, there's usually some sort of bias against taking medication wherever possible. So when I was smaller, for example, my dad used to take the antibiotic capsules. He used to break them open, and he only used to give us like a third of it because I think he was kind of worried that we'd get addicted to ampicillin or something like that. And I think there's always this idea that medication is bad, and especially for mental health. And if you guys could address some of that. Versa, did you have, yeah, if you had your own personal experience to share?
That when I was a teenager in the mental health unit at the hospital, I kind of bonded with some of the other patients there. There were people who were as young as 7 years old in the adolescent mental health unit, and then there were some that were up to the max 18 years old. And everyone, I remember one time we were just sitting on the couch in the kitchen, and we were just talking about how we were so afraid to tell the people that when we went back to school and we were left the hospital and we assimilated back into our school lives, that, you know, they would ask, where have we been? And like, you know, because we've been weeks in the mental health unit at the hospital, and we've missed school. And a lot of us have gotten on medication in the meantime, because the doctors prescribe it, and while you're a patient in the hospital, you must take the medication. And there was just this discussion about how we were so afraid to tell people that we'd taken medication. These were kids who were not only, like, there was a group of us. This was in Brampton, so they weren't just Asians. Even outside the Asian community, there's this stigma about taking medicine, and it's, I think, amplified within the Asian community. And I don't really know why that is. I just know that there's a huge, like, you know, avoidance of anything that has even not related to mental health, just medication in general. I don't know if you can speak to that.
Yeah, medications is something that a lot of my patients struggle with. And I know that most of my patients are not taking what I give them. So oftentimes I do preface it by saying, so how often are you taking the medications, right? So, how many days a week you manage to take it. I think that it's deep-seated in the Chinese culture that medications is not that good for you. There's a Chinese saying, 藥有三分毒, which means that all the medicine contains also a bit of poison in it. So it's just a Chinese saying that says any medicine is inherently also poisonous. So that's a cultural belief, and I think it's deep-seated, so I think people believe in that. Of course, on top of that, there's a perception that Western medicine is too strong for Chinese people because it's Western, it's not Chinese. So they would rather take all kinds of Chinese herbal stuff from the store because they're just Chinese herbal stuff. But if you take one pill from Western medicine, wow, that's so strong, right? Because in their mind, it's so much stronger. And then there is also this, for some Chinese people, they believe in the hot and cold system. I don't know if people are familiar. And so there are some of my Chinese patients that come back and say, you know, the one medicine you gave me is a little bit too hot. And sometimes they look at the color. If it's a red capsule, it's especially hot. If it's a blue tablet, okay, now it's a bit colder, so it's a little bit better. So there is the hot and cold interpretation on top of that. And then finally, I think that there is an interesting way of seeing medications, because in the Western world, when you get a certain age, you're going to have like a lower blood, like a blood pressure pill, a cholesterol pill, a blood sugar pill, right? And then the mental health pill. So there's all kinds of reasons why a person may skip a medication today. Because they have a little headache, because the sky is cloudy, because I woke up on the wrong side of bed, maybe I should skip it today. So there's all kinds of reasons. And then finally, it's because I'm taking 3 other medications, the 4th one must be bad. So sometimes they have an internal count of how many other medications they're taking, or because I have a Tylenol today, so I must skip my mental health pill. So that there's this kind of competition among medication. What I find helpful to discuss with them is they can understand that when they go to a Chinese herbalist, they're going to give them like 10 different herbs, all mixed together in one soup, right? The only difference is from Western medicine, it's not going to be 10 different things boiled to one pill. It's going to be 10 different pills, each one for a different purpose. Sometimes when they understand that principle, then they're okay to take more than one, because they know that each ingredient, a cocktail, It's actually just like a Chinese herbal soup. You need 10 ingredients to make one nasty tasting soup. And sometimes it takes 10 different capsules to balance the body. So sometimes once they understand that, it's better. Now, after you get through to the patient, then it's the next step. What Larissa is saying is concerned about what others are talking about. So sometimes you get through what the patient is talking about, but then the parents would say, be a strong son and try to skip the pill today. Be a strong daughter. Try to skip it today. Just try a little harder. And then finally, there's the Chinese pharmacist. And believe it or not, some of my Chinese patients or Asian patients, they go to the local Vietnamese Chinese pharmacy. And they would get from the pharmacist saying, you're such a young person, or you look like a strong person. Try to skip it if you can. And this is from the pharmacist. And so
It's very culturally believed.
it's like a culturally believed thing. So they get it from the parents, but they also get it from the local pharmacist. I want to have a word with the pharmacist, but but sometimes the pharmacist is the person who's the final person saying, you're taking this, and the person would be shaking their head, I can't believe you're so young, you're taking this. So that's like the final step.
Public health nurse. And thank you so much for, with your achievement. I'm so surprised you are still willing to talk to the community. And Dr. Fong, as far as I know, he is very solid in his knowledge and ability to actually cure people. Anyway, cure, seriously. And I myself have been in medical field for a long, long time. I know from my patients and myself and so on, I know that there are different levels of effectiveness on even counseling or a psychiatrist. So the thing you mentioned about the resistance for treatment, I think we are lucky in Canada with our universal healthcare system. Enable a lot of trial and error, and we have achieved today, I can reassure you, depression, for example, is definitely curable. I'm not kidding. And if you listen to Dr. Fong, okay? And the point is, the public is not educated. And I find a very good tool to notify our community is the media. And I'm telling you, people would spend the whole night watching TV drama series. And for example, the famous, much-loved singer, Zhang Guowing, he suffered from depression. And people, even today, after over 10 years, still want to remember his legacy. But nobody talk about how come he's not treated properly. And I wonder, with collaboration with Hong Fook or Dr. Fong, please be a media star. Tell them success stories. And we don't want to see people like Zhang Guowing to die prematurely. So there is a solution. And medicine, psychiatric medicine is very different from 20 years ago. Dr. Fong, you can agree with me that we don't have to suffer when you say the side effect. There are medicine, you are the one who opened my eyes, and that can really enable people to enjoy life. So I'm ready at any time, and the Chinese media always call me about new issues like the supervised injection site. Another issue is not talked about a lot is addiction within the ethno-racial community, as if the Chinese community do not have people who take fentanyl. Okay, so that's not true, but there's no talk about it. And our young people, integration for sure. Not only they integrate to many cases of unplanned pregnancy, there will be integration to take fentanyl. So please use the tools available, the Chinese media, and also bring out success stories. And some movie stars, I know a lot of Hong Kong movie stars doesn't know in Canada we actually have cure for mental health problems.
When you're talking about resistance of taking medications, does that mean then this community will be more open for cognitive behavioral therapy type, or no?
I think a lot of I work with a lot of youth, so for them is that they do not want it to be dependent on medication, as well as a lot of other substance that they take that it's influence their behavior, make it worse in. So they do not want to take medication in that kind of way. And even with the Asian community, we've been here for a long time. We learned that not to be invasive with their children, but once in a while they find medications that without their knowledge of the children see Dr. Feng, all right? So there's like you have mental health issues, right? So a lot of the youth that I work with, they do not want any trade of medication and not dependence on medication.
Yeah, and also the question about psychotherapy. Yeah, so the medication, people don't want to depend on it because they see it as a weakness also, and that's another issue. For psychotherapy, I think it depends again on the individual. There are, I think a lot of people can benefit from it. Just like knowledge about medications though, the idea about psychotherapy is not very well known to a lot of Asians. If you look at the TV show Fraser Crane, it kind of makes it popular to see a psychiatrist or psychologist. But in reality, right, people are still reluctant to seek help, right? They are nervous about seeing a psychiatrist, and they are also nervous talking about their own inner problems. So the idea to trust a stranger with your inner problems, some people have difficulties with that, or they might think that what's the point of talking? Sometimes they go the flip side is they would say, you're the expert, please fix my problem, because that's according to the Asian culture. Sometimes they flip the other side and say the hierarchy, you're the doctor, you're the expert, so why don't you just tell me what to do? And then we have to step back and say, as a counselor, that's not our job. It's actually to facilitate you to explore your issues. So there is also an educational process, if you will, of why it's okay to talk about your problems, why it's okay to admit that you have certain difficulties, and why it's also helpful to talk about your emotions, and why the doctors may not have all the answers. It's a collaborative process. So in other words, as much as it will, I think, help a lot of people, and you would think that for a culture that so much does not want to take medication, they would all go for psychotherapy. The reality is that I think that the understanding may not always be there. And then also there's the reality, Asian people have really good work ethic. So they are really reluctant to take time off from their bosses to come for a psychotherapy session, for example. And sometimes they have no choice. They may work in a factory, they may work in a place where they just do not want the employers to know, right? Whereas I see in other cultures, they are much more open to tell their boss, listen, I'm going to have every Wednesday afternoon off for my mental health day. And they're much more open to saying that. I find Asians have a lot of difficulty saying to the boss, listen, I need this.
But I'm wondering if that's just also endemic to Asian culture, not to actually feel free to express yourself. So even if they came to psychotherapy, I think there must be a learning curve for them to actually feel that they can talk. And I know in Asian culture, it's actually, you try your best to talk, but I think for a variety of reasons, especially like the 1.5 generation, like our parents, when they came home, they were tired. We didn't really learn to talk with our parents, mainly because they were tired when they came home, and as a result, it's really hard to enter into to talk about things. So psychotherapy sounds great on paper for a lot of people, but actually in the Asian culture, I think it's really challenging to express yourself, express your emotions, what you're going through, what sorts of issues you have, and it's not something that we, at least our generation, may be that comfortable with.
And I think that's exactly like your questions earlier, that what if they waited too long And at Hong Fook, we have different psychosocial groups. If you say there's a psychotherapy group, people don't come. But as Hong Fook, we have a self-help group or we have a social group. They come, and at the end of the sessions, they share their feelings, they do things together, and they're like, this is good. I wish we have Vietnamese self-help every day instead of every Thursday. So at Hong Fook, we have that sessions. We sort of do psychotherapy-ish, but we don't tell them. Because if we tell them, they don't come. But then they learn to communicate with each other. They learn how to support each other, and they feel good after. So we have that cater to people, and a lot of time we have clients who waited for a very long time and in treatment to go into this group, and then we have people who general public to come in and merge with this group and talk to them. So and they each get out of that session something is there, something. That's why they keep on coming back every Thursday to spend time, right? So every Thursday is Korean self-help. Every Tuesday Korean, every Thursday is Vietnamese, and then every Friday is everybody. We communicate in English, and they love it. After they learn in their own language group, and they go to their to communicate as a whole community. And I believe Monday is a Cantonese and Tuesday was a Mandarin as well, a different site. But that's how the group get together and learn how to speak, just the way you express that.
And at the same time, I don't want to say that Asians don't benefit from therapy. In fact, they do. And in fact, in our hospital too, at the Asian Initiative Mental Health Program, we are having a specific program that combines CBT and ACT and mindfulness as a specialized group program. Now, people, once they get over the initial difficulties of psychotherapy and also being in a group and telling other people their stories, we actually track the results. They improve very well in the group. And I'm also running another group, for example, and a lot of these groups we do in partnership between the Toronto Western and Hong Fook. With the Cambodian group, we have an ACT group right now going on with a Buddhist monk. So we have a cultural piece of delivering both a spiritual and cultural piece from the monk, plus I partner with the monk and I deliver the psychological piece of helping clients and patients look at it. So I think that once you have a way of letting people know about the benefits of psychotherapy, how it works, we see evidence of a lot of people benefiting from it.
And they open up more when they go to Dr. Fung's sessions. They will come to Hong Fook and they say, I've been to Dr. Fung's session. So they share with other members, which is very helpful for others.
My question is that would it be correct to assume that the resistance towards taking medication is deeply rooted in the stigma that the Asian community feel about mental health issues? And I have a personal in my family member who's suffering from mental health issues, and for years they stigmatize themselves. There's that sense of that's why they can't tell people that they have issues. They want to stay away from the community support group because they think they feel lack of self-confidence. So yes, I agree with this lady to say that to education is very important. Also, I feel the system, as I was talking to Emily earlier about how to navigate and the support for family members, because I'd love to have support on this side, not struggling by ourselves.
Thank you. We have a big support for family members. We also have resources that together with professionals and family members, we came up with the manual that can help the family members. They're also in English. It's free to download if you go on Hong Fook website. English, Cantonese, Mandarin, Vietnamese, and Cambodian, and also Korean, I mentioned. But I think Dr. Fung would agree with me is that family member is very important. They're 24/7 with the individual. We're not miracle workers. We can't get there all the time on time. Therefore, we think that family members needed the support and the education just to deal with their loved ones, and also to understand what their loved ones go through too. And if you go on our website, there's an extensive manual that you can download for free. And it goes step by step. And you're right, mental health system is not very super friendly, especially for a family member to assist somebody as well, because just the Protections Act with confidentiality for the clients, for the patient. So if Dr. Fung can comment on that, how to easier access the mental health system.
I think, I think that access to services is a key because we've done a study together, right, through the Harmful Women's Program, and we found that access is the key. Like people feel like there's a really safe place that they can trust and open up. Obviously, our two organizations are open for business, so to speak, that we want to encourage people to seek us out if we can help them, the Asian Initiative Mental Health Program, and also Hong Fook. We also have an early intervention psychosis program. The idea is that people at the very first earlier stages of psychotic symptoms, like feeling paranoid, hearing voices. Our pamphlets is there. This is Jian, my clinician. This is like a mini ad, but there's going to be like our brochures there for the early intervention psychosis program. So the idea is that people at the earlier stages of psychosis, if they get treatment, that they're going to have better outcomes. So because people with psychosis, oftentimes they're in their developmental years, like in the university or college, and that's when psychosis occurs. So we certainly encourage that, and there's some of our brochures. So seeking early treatment is key. I think everyone can turn to their family doctors. They should be encouraged to do so. But I think all of you here are messengers, right? So that's why we have forums like this, because the key to spreading out the message is through community, not only through health professionals. That if we all stand up and speak passionate about it from our own, whether you're a family member or friends, I think that's where the key is. And then, of course, we organize events like MindFest, another promotion, through the University of Toronto, but actually in partnership with everyone you see here, including Healthy Minds Canada, including Hong Fook, and all these organizations and University of Toronto and Ryerson. We have a mental health day called MindFest. Notice it's called Fest because it's really a celebration. We don't really want everyone to think it's a drag to go to a mental illness event. It's MindFest. So it's a full day event and it's completely free of charge. It's both at Hart House and in the evening at the Ryerson. And then we also have a film in the evening in this hall at U of T. So all of this is to promote this. So again, all of you here, I encourage you to pick up a bookmark and promote for us. The more we get this in the conversation going, not wait until someone commits suicide on the news and say, okay, or someone commit a murder, and that's not where mental health is. Mental health is with us every single day. We all have challenges every day. We all have our own battles. So we all have a part in this. So I encourage all of you to take these bookmarks for yourself or give it out to friends and make this an issue.
And that is a wrap. So I wanted to thank all of you for coming. I wanted to thank Bill Chu, Kenneth Fung, Emily, can't remember your last name.
Emily
Wing, and Larissa Florette, because I tell you, it is just remarkable to have all you guys up here. This is an interesting subject. And Cynthia, thank you for organizing this. Cynthia came to me the other day and wanted to get this message out within the Asian community, and I said, that's great, don't have time to organize anything, do you want to do it? So she has undertaken all of this. I do encourage you to go to MindFest. It is great. We love these kinds of events where all the organizations that are out there, sometimes competing for dollars to raise, but we get together to spread the message so that everyone can benefit from that. We have, at Healthy Minds Canada, we have our AGM coming up. It's on October 3rd. If you sign up for our newsletter, you'll get some information about that. We have a hike and learn in October. Instead of a lunch and learn, we're going to get people moving, and we're going to do a little walk through a ravine and get out into nature. And then in November 13th, we've got our annual fundraiser, which is called the Silver Dinner, and that's where we make some money so we can put these events on. So please come and support us. And that's it. We are done. These guys will be sticking around for a little bit to do little segments for our website, so feel free to ask them any questions to get your